Welcome to the last installment for Speaking of History for this year. Thank you so much for your support through our entire season. I appreciate it. If you haven't seen me before, my name is Laura Winnie. I'm the Curator of Education here. We have Rick Baker, former mayor of St. Petersburg, and I'm pretty sure he can chat about himself much better than I can. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Rick Baker. Thank you.
Well, happy St. Patrick's Day. Thank you, Laura, and it is good to be back at Heritage Village. I'm going to talk a little bit about Beyond the Sunshine, my current book. I've written 3 books. My first one was called Mangroves to Major League, and it was about the history of St. Petersburg. And I actually published that one in 2000, right before I ran for mayor. I was mayor from 2001 to 2010 in St. Pete. And while I was researching the pictures for Mangroves to Major League, I spent an awful lot of time here at Heritage Village in the archive, as I did at Museum of History in St. Pete and the St. Pete Times and all other buildings, USF. Back then, I would have to search all these different archives, and I'd go through and I'd have to get the pictures scanned and everything else. For this current book, interesting, and it took forever. For this current book, I have over 500 pictures in this book, and I got 95% of them from the Florida archives. And rather than have to go to Tallahassee and go through that, you go to a website called floridamemory.com, where they have 200,000 pictures. And there you can search for them like you're doing a Google search, and you can grab them down and you can click them and grab them and click them and grab them and click them and grab them. And then I write a summary of it. Actually, they have summaries in there, but I usually write my own summary. And then I send it to my publisher by email, and they just put it in the right place and in the right place, the right place. And so it took me, 1/100th of the time to get many, many more pictures, and I got some really awesome pictures for that. So it's amazing how just in the last 20 years, technology has changed to help us do things faster and quicker. It's a good thing. But Heritage Village is a great, great asset for our community. I'm glad that you support it. I believe in remembering your history and honoring your history and teaching it to your children. It's a good thing. A lot of people ask me, I've now, 2 of my 3 books I've written were history books. And people ask me, why do you write history books? You certainly don't make money writing history books, I can promise you that. But I write them because I think it's important. And if I were to summarize it, I would go back to one of my I have 2 favorite figures in modern world history. One is Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill, as you all know, during World War II, before the United States got into the war, he really had the entire world, the entire free world on his back. He was the voice for democracy for the world at the time. And he was standing up to the attacks, and he, even during that war, he would get his generals together and he would tell them, read history, study the history of battles, study the history of these countries. Because remember that the farther backward you can look, the farther forward you can see. And I believe that is so, so true. When I was mayor, I wrote a book on the history of St. Pete, and a year later I was mayor of the city for 9 years. And I can tell you how helpful it was for me to know the history. I knew every time I faced anything, I knew exactly how we had gotten to where we were. And that was able to enable us to make some of the decisions that led to the great renaissance of our city over that period of time and since. So history is important. My book here, Laura, if we could go ahead and start it. my book here, this is going to be just scrolling as I'm talking, and what I say is going to be completely unrelated to what you see on the screen. But it gives you an idea of how my book is set up. It's divided into 8 formats, 8 different eras. And each era, it's like Ford's early years, one is Civil War and Reconstruction. And each era begins with a full page or maybe 2-page summary of that era. So you can read through and get the entire summary. And from there, I break right into a timeline. And so in the Civil War, it might start out with a discussion of what happened during that period of the Civil War and Reconstruction. And then right afterwards, it goes on such and such a date in 1861, so-and-so withdrew from the Union and we began, game on. And so it gives, in the timeline entries as you see them are long enough where you can get, it's not like Pearl Harbor Day, it gives you a good summary of the events so you can understand it. And yet at the same time, it's quick enough where you can read it. So you really don't have to really work your way through a lengthy discussion history book like a lot of the traditional history books. You can get a very thorough knowledge of the history of our state in a weekend. You could read this book in a weekend and have a very thorough knowledge of the history of the state. As you see when you go through, you'll see that some of the typeset is in Roman, which is traditional, and some of it is in italics. And so the Roman is the traditional typeset is for what's happening in Florida. Italics is what's happening outside Florida. So you, as you're reading through, you can read the history of what's going on here in the context of what's going on other places in the country and in the world. So even the early years, you'll see what's going on with the Togobagans here in St. Petersburg, and at the same time, you might read about what's going on with Alexander the Great, and it kind of gives you the context of when it was happening, because we don't necessarily think of ourselves as being in the same context from a period of time of what was going on in Europe and Africa and other places, but it was, and that gives you the context. And similarly, in the Civil War, you can see what's going on in Florida at the same time that you're seeing the major events unfold during the Civil War period as you're going through. So that's the way it's set up. And I'm a picture guy, so I like it to come to life. So as I told you, I dug through and find 500 pictures, over 500 pictures. And I would say the vast majority of pictures that I've got in here have never been published before. Some of them have never been anywhere before. I found them from people that just had them for, one lady had saved a picture. She was over 100, she was 100 years old when I met her. And she had saved a picture from World War I that was of her brother, who was a Coast Guardsman on the Coast Guard cutter Tampa, that was sunk in the Irish Sea by a U-boat in 1918 during the war. And she came back after I was talking to her in her house. She came back with a file that she opened up that she had kept since 1918, and she picked out her brother's picture and handed it to me. So of course that's in the book. It's him along with 3 other coasties that were right about to get on the ship to go across the sea during World War I. And you could just see the tears in her eyes 80, 90 years later when I was talking to her about it. It was amazing thing. So it's the pictures bring it to life. I have the picture of the first fatal accident on Daytona Beach during one of their early races in 1903 when they were racing on the beach. The first V-2 rocket to take off of Cape Canaveral in 1950. So it really brings it to life and it helps me. Now I don't have books with me other than the one I'm holding, but my wife Joyce is here. She's playing Vanna White for us today. And she's handed out some of those flyers. You can get my book on Amazon. Amazon's the easiest way to get it. But definitely Haslam's has got it, and most of the bookstores should have it as well. So if you go anywhere, you should be able to find it good. But Amazon is usually the quickest and the easiest way to do it. I don't know if Heritage Park has a bookstore or not, but the Heritage Village. But anyway, so what I'm going to do now is I've got about a half an hour, and I've got a captive audience. So I am going to, my book goes from 12,000 BC until Hurricane Irma last year. So it's a very comprehensive thing, okay? And I'm going to tell you the history of Florida in the next half an hour. And I'm going to, I may have to skip one or two things as I do that, but I am going to start at the same place I start, which is in my book in 12,000 BC. So I see a lot of panicked eyes in the audience. I promise you the first 13,000 years goes by very quickly when I talk. So 13,000 BC. And by the way, I'm going to tell you what happened in 12,000 BC. I really wasn't there. And so much of what what I've learned about history, I believe, is, and I've written 2 books now, is a educated guess. You know, we have I'm tied to a group called La Florida, which is over at the Florida Studies program at USF. And La Florida, it's an interesting group. They are people that are, they have studied 15th and 16th century Spanish, which is much different. And the way they wrote back then was a lot different. And so you got to really learn you have to take another year learning it even if you know Spanish. And then they go to Seville, Spain, and there's an archives there. And there's an archives of old Spanish writings from that era that they are going through every day that has never been translated before. And so they're reading like ship manifests of ships that were going back and forth to Florida during that period of time, or letters that were written to the crown, or diaries of people that went back. So every day we're learning more from these folks about the history of Florida that we think we know now. But we don't necessarily know, and it evolves. And we are one archaeological discovery away from finding out that maybe something happened a lot earlier than we thought it did, because we find out some relic that is from 5,000 years earlier or something. So I say all that to say that I'm going to talk about all this stuff as if it's fact, and most of it is probably pretty close, but it's history evolves, and I say that. So with that qualification, 12,000 BC. People believe that historians believe that the first Aborigines, the first humans, crossed over the Bay. It was during the last great ice age, and so when the ice age came, it sucked all the ice out of the ocean, right? And so the ocean tables went way down, and when they went down, there was a land mass between Alaska and Russia at the Bering Straits, and so that land mass was exposed. And it allowed humans to get from Russia and Asia into the North American continent. And so 12,000 BC, we think that's when that happened. By 10,000 BC, we think that those folks made their way down to Florida. And so nomads were starting to arrive in what we now call Florida, the peninsula of Florida. At the time that they arrived, the Florida was twice the width that it is today, because the sea level had gone down. And so we were twice the width. And the west coast of Florida, where we sit today, we think we're on the west coast. The west coast was another 100 miles into the Gulf of Mexico of Florida back at that period of time. So earlier civilizations had some civilizations that were along this land between here and 100 miles into the Gulf of Mexico at the time. 8,000 BC, the Ice Age ended. It ended over a period of time, but it was ending. And eventually the ice would melt and the water tables would rise, and we would get to be where we are today. 1492, Columbus sailed. Thank you. Okay, see? You all are part of the team now. Okay. We see how fast 13,000 years went by the way? Let me just point that out. Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He did not make it to Florida, but he did make it to the Bahamas. But in 1513, Ponce de Leon was given the order of the lead of Spain to come over and take La Florida. We didn't have a name for it at the time. He landed on the east coast of our state at that point, and it was during the Easter season and the Feast of the Flowers. And so because it was the Feast of the Flowers, a holy day, he named it after that feast. He named us La Florida, after the flowers. And he at the time Ponce de Leon arrived, historians believe that there were somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 Native Americans living in Florida at the time Ponce de Leon arrived. And they had the Temeculans, was a very large civilization up in northeast Florida and Georgia. The Ayas, I may mispronounce these, but Ayas is around the east coast, around where Ponce de Leon came in. The Tequesta down in Miami, the Matacumbi down in the Keys, the Calusa down in southwest Florida, here the Tocobagans, the Ocala and Ocala, the Appalachia up in the Big Bend area, and then the Pensacola on the west in the Big Bend, and it in the Panhandle, and there are others as well. But so there were a lot of folks here when Ponce de Leon arrived. His second time he came back to southwest Florida. He learned how many folks were here, because they attacked him. He got into a war with them, battle with them down in the Calusa in southwest Florida. He was wounded and he died from the wounds as he was going back to Cuba. After Ponce de Leon, Panfilo de Narvaez came here in 1528. We like Narvaez. We know of Narvaez because he landed here. He landed in the jungle area of St. Petersburg, and he brought about 300 people ashore. And the Narvaez expedition was the first European expedition to cross the North American continent, the first. And it went from here in St. Pete all the way over to it ended in Mexico City, made it to the Pacific. And of the 300 people that arrived, they actually lost track of their ships pretty quickly, so their ships go back to Spain or to Mexico. And the 300 folks had to walk their way all the way around the Gulf Coast, all the way back to eventually to Mexico City. Of the 300, 4 survived, and all the rest died along the way. There's a great book. First of all, they have the diary of one of the fellows on the expedition that lived, and you can get that at Haslam's and probably other places, and which is a very interesting read. It's like written back in 1500s, right? So it's very. The book that was written about it is called The Brutal Journey. So if you brutal, brutal, The Brutal Journey, and it was a brutal journey, and it talks about it along the way. It was a tough trip. So 1528, Narvaez. After him came De Soto. De Soto also did a similar expedition. His group went up the Mississippi. De Soto also died along the expedition. Pedro Menendez in 1565 arrived. He came and he landed in St. Augustine, and he founded St. Augustine, which is the oldest continuous settlement in the United States. And a lot of people up north, if you went to school, you think it's Jamestown. It ain't. It's St. Augustine. And by far, it was like 100 years before Jamestown. But if you're from Pensacola, you have a certain amount of dispute about this, because you actually had Luna arrive in Pensacola before Menendez arrived in St. Augustine. Unfortunately, Luna's expedition only lasted for about a year or so, and you're never really quite sure where he stayed. But so the Pensacola likes to claim the first settlement there, but I don't get into that battle. And I spoke in Pensacola about that. I was very careful in how I talked about it. So 1565, Menendez arrives. He's formed St. Augustine, and they between St. Augustine and Tallahassee, they establish a number of missions. And the missions are obviously they're trying to, what I said about the Spanish, when I talk about the Spanish, when the Spanish came to the Americas during this period of time, they had two objectives. One of their objectives was to convert the natives to Christianity. And so they formed missions, they brought priests with them, and they were trying to convert them to Christianity. And the other objective was to kill them and steal their gold and silver and take it all back to Spain. So those were I always thought they're kind of inconsistent missions that the Spanish had back then. But that's what they did. And now they didn't find any gold or silver in Florida, which is why we didn't get the kind of immigration from Spain that they got in Central and South America, where they found all the gold and silver. So it wasn't that heavily populated with the Spanish, but it was populated enough for the Spanish to be able to infect the natives with Spanish diseases for which the natives did not have an immunity. And by the early 1700s, much of the native population throughout Florida had been wiped out. By the earlier 1700s, 1740 or so, you had the Creek Indians and some others, but mostly Creeks, from British America, which we were Spanish Florida, and British America was north of us. And the Creeks from British America, none of the natives were being treated very well, so they fled to Spanish America and as a way to get away. And they became known as the Cimarrones, which is at the time was the Spanish word for runaway, because they were running away from the British America. And Cimarrones eventually became Seminole Indians. And so the Seminole civilization came here in the 1740s or so. Yeah. And then they grew and grew and grew and grew. And mostly in North Florida and in Central Florida. 1763 was the end of the French and Indian War, and the Spanish were on the wrong side of that, so the Florida became British. So we became British Florida from 1763 to 1783, and the British divided us into two, East Florida and West Florida. They each had their own capital, and the capital of East Florida was St. Augustine. West Florida was Pensacola. West Florida went all the way to New Orleans at the time, and it was British. So 1783, 20 years later, is the end of the American Revolution. And at the end of the American Revolution, the British were on the wrong side this time, and Florida went back to the Spanish at that point. Now, when Florida went from Spanish to British, much of the Spanish population left. They went to Cuba and to Mexico to get out because it was becoming a British colony. And so, and then in 1783, when we became Spanish again, it didn't get that heavily populated by the Spanish at that period of time, so 1783. So then just a few more years later, 1812, the War of 1812, and 1814 was the Battle of New Orleans, when Andrew Jackson became the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. And 1818, a few years after that, Secretary of War Calhoun sent Andrew Jackson to Florida because there was American shipping that was going up the Apalachicola River through Spanish Florida to Georgia, and it was being attacked. And in response to those attacks, they sent Andrew Jackson down. Andrew Jackson was a pretty aggressive guy. He came down and he took over Pensacola right away. He took over St. Mark's right away. He sent word to Secretary of War Calhoun. He said, I just send me a few more troops. I'll take over St. Augustine. I'll take over Havana, and just let's do it. And the Spanish decided that was enough. And a year later, in 1819, they agreed to give Florida to the United States of America. And by 1821, we were part of the United States of America as a territory. At the same time that Andrew Jackson came in to take on the Spanish, he also took on the Seminoles. And he began the first of what would be, in 1818, the first of what would be 3 Seminole Wars. And the Seminole Wars would go from 1818 to 1858. At the end of the first Seminole War, the Seminoles would be put on a reservation that would go from the Caloosahatchee River to the Peace River. So the Caloosahatchee River up around Crystal River, down to the Peace River, down around Port Charlotte, and off the coast and pretty much west of Lake Okeechobee, about 4 million acres of land that they were put in that area. And then during the second Seminole War was when we built a lot of our forts. Fort Lauderdale was built, Fort Hood was built, Fort Myers. A lot of forts were built during that period of time, during the second Seminole War. And at the end of the second Seminole War, they were sent to a reservation in Big Cypress Swamp, which is west of the Everglades and south of Lake Okeechobee, another 4 million acres in Big Cypress Swamp. And at the end of the third Seminole War, most of the Seminoles had been either killed or relocated to Oklahoma and Arkansas. So there were only 200 Seminoles left in the state of Florida at the time, and they were mostly around the Big Cypress and the Everglades area at the time. So that was 1858, end of the third Seminole War. We had a relatively short period of peace because in 1860, the Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States, and in 1861, the southern states seceded from the Union, and we became part of the Confederacy at that point. During the Civil War, people don't think much about Florida during the Civil War, but there was a lot going on in Florida during the Civil War. First, we were almost the first battle of the Civil War. Fort Sumter, as you know, was the first battle in Charleston. But Fort Pickens in St. Rosa Island off of Pensacola was what happened was Lincoln had blockaded the entire South, right, leading into the Civil War, and he had ordered the reinforcement of the major southern ports, including Fort Pickens and Fort Sumter. Fort Pickens was reinforced. It's an island fort right in Pensacola Bay there. It's very hard to get to if you're trying to go after it. And the Florida militia had been ordered by the Florida legislature to go take all the federal forts. And this was before the war began. And so they were lining up at Fort Pickens getting ready to take it when Fort Sumter, the first battle of the Civil War, the Fort Pickens battle followed pretty shortly after that. So during the Civil War, we had a lot going on our ports because of the blockade and because we have such a long coastline that we had an opportunity to smuggle goods in from the Bahamas and other areas in for the Southern effort, because the Southern, during the Civil War, didn't have a lot of manufacturing, right? They were mostly agricultural based. So they had to import guns and bullets and things like that for the Civil War effort. And so they would get it a lot from European countries that were coming through the Bahamas. And then, but they had to smuggle all that past Lincoln's blockade that he had done. And they would do that in Florida to try to get those supplies in. The second thing that was going on is we created salt works along the coastal areas where we would boil salt water to create salt that was used for the Southern effort as well. And probably the biggest thing that was going on in Florida was the cattle industry. And we provided a lot of the cattle and the beef for the Southern effort during the Civil War. A major cattle industry was growing in Florida, providing it to the Southern effort. And then when Vicksburg on the Mississippi River fell in 1863, then at that point, the South was completely cut off from Texas and Oklahoma because the North controlled the Mississippi River. And so our beef became very, very important. In 1864, really the only major battle of the Civil War in Florida was the Battle of Olustee, which was 60 miles west of Jacksonville, and it was an effort by the federal troops to stop the Confederacy, the Florida cow cavalry, from bringing the cows and the cattle up into the South in order to supply the effort. The Confederacy won that battle, and it continued to ship through that period of time. Tallahassee, capital of Florida, was the only capital east of the Mississippi not to fall during the Civil War. People like to brag about that, but really nobody wanted it. It was just not. It was not of nearly the strategic importance that Richmond was, or any of the other major Southern efforts were, and obviously it was taken over right after. Now we love Tallahassee. I should say, be careful. I'm a Florida State guy, so we love Tallahassee. That's for the video, okay? I love Tallahassee. But it's a very important capital. But it's at the time it was just not strategic for the North to take over Tallahassee. So end of the Civil War, we were like the rest of the South, we were desolate. The Florida was financially collapsed. It was you can imagine what the condition was. The only railroad we had in the Florida, only major railroad, went from Jacksonville down to Crystal River. Had been built during the Civil War in 1861. But it was built with internal improvement fund funds, and you can imagine there was no business on it during the Civil War, and so no paying business, and so it was the internal improvement fund in Florida was bankrupt, and the state of Florida was largely bankrupt, and that just kind of continued for the 1870s. We did have our Reconstruction troops left in 1868, 3 years after the war, much earlier than 1876 when the rest of the Reconstruction troops left the South. But needless to say, we weren't in good shape during that period of time. 1881, we had a Governor, William Bluxom, made a deal with a fellow named Hamilton Diston. And this was it's probably one that they don't talk about in schools, but I think the most significant agreement ever take place in Florida history, because of the impact it has. Whether you like the impact or don't like the impact, it was the most impactful contract ever happened. And what the contract was the state was sold Hamilton Diston. Hamilton Diston was from Philadelphia. He was the heir to a saw manufacturing fortune up in Philadelphia. And so he had a lot of money. He came down here and he gave $1 million to the state of Florida, which 1881 was a boatload of money. And in exchange for that, he got 4 million acres of land in the state of Florida. Most of that land was north and west of Lake Okeechobee. So that transaction, and he was charged with the task of draining the land around Lake Okeechobee in order to create an agricultural industry for the state of Florida. So two things came from that, probably a lot more than two, but one of them was it provided money for the Internal Improvement Fund to be able to go back bonds so other people could build railroads, because most people that are coming bringing a railroad down, they have to get financing for it, so they have to sell bonds to do that. In order to sell the bonds, it helps a whole lot if the state of Florida has backed it and if the state of Florida has some money in the bank to back it. So that $1 million helped back that and did that. So people like Henry Flagler were able to come down in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and Henry Plant and others, and build a railroad. So during that period of time, Henry Flagler built the railroad all the way from Jacksonville all the way down to Key West. In the 1920s, he got down to Key West finally. A lot of people died building that railroad along the way. A ton of people in the Keys died building that railroad. The hurricane hit during the construction. It was a very, very tough thing. But every place that I believe Henry Flagler is one of, if not the most impactful people ever to be in Florida, and yet I don't think he gets recognized that way. But he every place he went on the East Coast, he created a city, and he created these beautiful hotels. He would build infrastructure for the city. He would build, because he wasn't building the railroad just to make money bringing people. Building a railroad is really a real estate deal, where you're getting the land around that railroad at the same time, which was part of the deal, that you would get a certain amount of land along the railroad as you built it. And then you put your hotels and you put your other developments that you make a lot of money on. And so that was his deal, and he invested a fortune doing that all the way down the west. And so places like Miami and Fort Lauderdale and Palm Beach and all the way, St. Augustine, all these places really didn't much, St. Augustine existed, but the rest of those didn't much going on in those cities. Not much going on south of Gainesville before this period of time. So that really sparked a lot of development of a lot of cities by Henry Flagler. Henry Plant did the same thing more in Central Florida. Eventually his system, after he died, continued to build all the way down to Naples and create that. Of course, here Peter Demenchev brought the railroad to Pinellas County. He came down from, it's a great story, but I don't have time for it, but unless somebody has. It came all the way down from Central Florida, Sanford, all the way across, came down through Tarpon Springs, all the way down through Clearwater, angled over to downtown St. Petersburg, and he had made a deal with the founder of St. Petersburg to get half of what is now downtown St. Pete in exchange for bringing the railroad to town. So that was Hamilton. Peter Demenchev did that. We now call him Peter Demenz. If you've ever been to Demon's Landing in St. Pete, it's named after Peter Demenchev. And the reason we have the Detroit Hotel in downtown St. Pete is because John Williams, the founder of St. Pete, was from Detroit. So anyways, that railroad era sparked a lot of development, a lot of boom in this railroad era. The second thing that was part of the Hamilton-Diston deal was he was going to drain the land around the Everglades, because back in the 1800s, you needed an agricultural industry, because that was a big part of the economy, and also people had to eat, right? So if you're going to develop as a state, people got to eat. And so the idea was to drain, what they did was they took all the lakes. So you start over right about Orlando, and Lake Kissimmee and all that. It's called the Kissimmee Waterway. And all those little lakes, they started connecting them with canals. And I have pictures in the book of all these dredges back in the 1800s dredging these canals between these lakes up there. And then they connected it to the Kissimmee River. And the Kissimmee River used to flow like a meandering lake, and they straightened it out, right? And it became kind of a sewage dump, actually, because they drained it. The land that came into that went right down into Lake Okeechobee. And then the idea was, then you had to get, what do you do with after you're done with Lake Okeechobee? Well, Hamilton-Diston didn't finish the deal. In 1905, we had a governor elected named Napoleon Bonaparte Broward. That name should tell you everything you need to know about Napoleon Bonaparte Broward. And Napoleon Bonaparte Broward was a former gun runner to Cuba before he became governor. And his goal was to finish the job of draining the swamp. And so he then built canals that connected to the St. Lucie River from Lake Okeechobee. So we now had all the water, the swamp area north of Lake Okeechobee was being drained into Lake Okeechobee with no place to go. So what he did was he built a canal that connected the St. Lucie River to the east, and then to Palm Beach and Fort Lauderdale and Miami, and then he connected a canal on the west to the Caloosahatchee River to Fort Myers. And so that enabled the water to drain from the north into Lake Okeechobee and then drain out into the Gulf of Mexico. They built reservoirs south of the lake so it could provide a water supply for the southeast Florida because of the people. As that grew in population, you had to have a water supply. And a lot has been done since then. And so that was a good news, bad news thing. The good news was it succeeded in its objective, which was to create a fertile, rich agricultural area for Florida. So all around Lake Okeechobee to the north, you have massive cattle farms, milk farms, beef farms, and you've got agriculture, orange groves up to the north of the lake. And then to the south of the lake, the sugar industry came, and you have large sugar industry, but you also have virtually any other kind of vegetables and agricultural industry you could find to the south of the Lake Okeechobee and around there. So it created this economic agricultural belt and a food basket for the people of the state of Florida. That was the good news part. Bad news part is it had an enormously destructive impact on the environment. It had a destructive impact on the Kissimmee River, on Lake Okeechobee, and on the Everglades, on Florida Bay, all the way down. And so what happened was when they first started this agricultural industry, they built an earthen dam dike around Lake Okeechobee. In order to keep the water up until it flowed out to the Atlantic and stuff, so they could not have it. Because what happened is, used to be the water, the swamp water, and the river and everything would flow down into Lake Okeechobee from the north, and then Lake Okeechobee is a shallow lake. It would flow over the banks of the lake to the south, and would become what Marjorie Stoneman Douglas would call the river of grass, and it would just gradually flow through the Everglades and into Florida Bay, and create just a very unique. It's a unique eco environment on an ecosystem on our planet. So that's the way it worked. Now afterwards, they put an earthen dam around it. They drained the water out, and a couple things happened as a result of that. One was we had a bad hurricane hit in 1928, and it broke the earthen dam, killed 2,000 people because it flooded like the entire town of Palm Bay. It was 450 people, I think it was, all died in the hurricane. So a lot of people died. And then Herbert Hoover came back and built a better dam. So now now it's called the Hoover Dike that's around Lake Okeechobee right now. But what it also did is so the agriculture interests north of the lake, whether it's the fertilizer and nitrogen from fertilizer, or it's the cattle or the manure from the cattle, it flowed into the ecosystem, kind of flowed into this now straightened out Kissimmee River, and then just become kind of a sewage pit into Lake Okeechobee, and then flowed out. And so it first of all, and then as it flowed into the Everglades, you brought in this nitrogen-rich water that created exotics growing in the Everglades and choking out the natural plants and things in the Everglades and the animals that depended on them. And at the same time, you robbed water from the Everglades, because the water that used to just flow down through the Everglades into Florida Bay, and the fresh water that went into Florida Bay. And the fresh water that went into Florida Bay was further hurt because in 1928, we built the Tamiami Trail, which became effectively a dam that cut off the southern part of the state. So from an environmental perspective, the enterprise was a disaster. I always try to keep in mind these folks were making these decisions in the 1800s, and their objective was not an environmental ecosystem. It was we need a breadbasket beginning in in the 40s, in the late 40s, with I think it was late 47. I think it was Marjorie Stoneman Douglas's book River of Grass, and then Herbert Hoover forming the Everglades National Park. Beginning really with that, it started a little earlier, but that was the main impetus. It seems like ever since then we've been trying to fix it. And we've had effort after effort after governor, and legislator, and we've made progress. There's no denying that the progress has been made, but there's an enormous amount of work still to be done in that effort right now, and it's still, just in this last gubernatorial race, it is still a big issue, the environment and the ecosystem, the repairing it. I, for one, believe that, I believe that it's one of the most important issues facing the state of Florida, that we have to do that because our future is so tied to the health of our land that we have to get that right. And it's an enormously costly and hard thing, and it's not going to be done in a short period of time, but the effort has to continue to be made. So the 20s boom, it created this boom, and so because of the railroads created this boom and activity and everything else, and people started coming for hotels and this and that, and we got into this big lot boom, which I could go on, but it's a hilarious thing that we started all the cities started dividing up their cities into more residential lots than you could possibly sell, because I think we had 20 million residential lots divided up. One source told me, and now keep in mind we've only gotten 20 million people here within the last few years. So they're divided, but they were using them as investment property. And they were selling them for investments, and the prices were going up, and the tourists would come down, and we'd sell them lots, and they'd go back, and we'd write letters to our friends in Ohio, and we'd tell them, come on, buy some lots in Florida, and they'd buy lots in Florida. And actually, by the mid-20s, the attorney generals in the north started issuing orders prohibiting banks in their communities from sending money into the state of Florida. Okay. So what happens is it started to pull the money out, but also we just got to the point, and Walter Fuller, anybody ever heard of Walter Fuller? There's Walter Fuller Park here in St. Pete. Walter Fuller is a crazy developer at the time. I love Walter. He's written a couple books. He said, well, the prices kept going up and up and up and up and up, and then we run out of suckers. And that's what happened, and they ran out of suckers, and the prices just collapsed. In 1925, we had a real estate depression in the state of Florida, followed in 1929 by the Great Depression. During the boom, it was booming so much that in Miami, the dollar value of construction in 1925 was 13 times the dollar value 5 years earlier in 1920. That's the boom. And the St. Petersburg Times had 90 pages of real estate ads on Sunday. Okay, so that gives you an indication of the boom. So it boom, 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 and then poof, and then during the collapse, 146 banks went out of business in Florida. Every bank in St. Petersburg went out of Florida, and back then there was no insurance. So if your bank lost all its money, you just lost all your money. So imagine the communities represented by each of these banks going out of business and losing people's savings and everything that they had. They were losing their money, and so we just bled through it. 25% of the homes in Fort Lauderdale went into foreclosure. 25%. So that's the way the whole state was going during the whole period of time. I always say Florida boomed like nobody boomed. We crashed like nobody crashed during that, and so we bled our way through the 1930s, and then we get to 1941. December 7th, Pearl Harbor, we go to war. Florida became the training center for the whole country in World War II. We wound up having training bases all over the state of Florida. You had Army Air Corps, which is now Air Force. So you had Homestead Air Base, you had MacDill Air Base, you had Tyndall and Eglin in the Panhandle. You had Pensacola Naval Air Base. You had Jacksonville Naval Air Base. Here, St. Petersburg Clearwater Airport was an Army Air Corps base during that time. Here in our county, we had a naval base in downtown St. Pete, Coast Guard Air Base at Wheaton Island. We had a naval air base to train people to land on aircraft carriers. And the thing is, back in the 20s, we built all these hotels. We built a ton here, and then within 5 years after we built them, we had the Depression. Well, guess what? When the war took over, they all became military housing during the war. So the the War Department leased all the hotels in Florida, and this was not just St. Pete, Miami, all over the state of Florida. We were training for people. After the war, the economy turned around. 1950, the first V-2 rocket took off from Cape Canaveral. At that point, by 1957, Sputnik. By 1958, we're at war. We're now in a space race, right, with the Russians. And 58, NASA's formed. NASA goes to Cape Canaveral. Cape Canaveral's formed. We get our satellite up in 1958, and then we enter the Mercury program. John Kennedy says we're going to the moon. Apollo program, shuttle program. So the east coast of Florida becomes the center of activity for the space industry, which was under the last administration. We backed away from manned airspace, and that had a negative impact on that. But for that period of time, it was very, very big. During this period of time, I always like to say, before World War II, tourists came down here for the sun, which they did. So they might be in downtown at a hotel. After the war, I think they came for the beach, and a lot of the beach hotels got built and development around. And then in 1971. Mickey Mouse came to town, and the whole epicenter for tourism changed in the state of Florida, and has really shifted ever since. And I'll end it now, but I've saved some time for some questions. During that same period of time, we wound up really, the retirement industry was born. And what happened was under FDR, we had created Social Security, and so Social Security, for the first time, it used to be retirees, if they saved it, they had it, but if they didn't save it, they didn't have it. They may live with their kids or whatever. By beginning probably 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, all of a sudden retirees had disposable income because they had Social Security, and they sometimes had retirement plans and that sort of thing. Even middle income America had retirement income, which was a new thing. And so where else but Florida? You didn't have to live in Pittsburgh anymore. You could move to Florida now. So you came down here, you might get a mobile home, you might get an apartment, or eventually a condo or a co-op or whatever else. And just by the droves, people started coming. By 1990, the retirement industry in Florida was $55 billion of retirement income a year coming into the state of Florida. So think about when you think of the industries in Florida, people often don't say retirement, but think about how much income from what kind of a business you would have to have $55 billion that you're paying in salaries to employees. And that's effectively what we have here is with the retirees in the state of Florida. So it's a very, very critical industry in the state of Florida. So now I've brought you on. I could talk a lot more, but I'm way over time. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.